Hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome to my review of Doctor Who FLUX Episode 3, Once Upon Time. Now before we get started, I just want to say apologies for this video being a little bit later than usual. I'm recording this on the Monday as opposed to the Sunday when I usually record these reviews, and that's because I couldn't actually watch the episode until Monday because I was working yesterday from 3 until 10:30, so obviously you'll understand there was no time for me to even watch the episode on Sunday, let alone record a review. So I had to watch it a day later on the Monday, the day that I'm recording this, and obviously now I'm recording my review, so apologies for it being a little bit late, but yeah, unfortunately it couldn't be helped. But anyway, Doctor Who Once Upon Time. This was a particularly interesting episode, wasn't it? As I usually do with these reviews, I haven't looked at what anyone thinks of this episode. I like to record these reviews before being influenced by other people's opinions, and yeah, I managed to stay off social media over the few hours or so, the last 12 hours from the episode going out until watching it, and I haven't looked at social media now, so I'm very much anticipating going onto Twitter and onto YouTube and seeing what people thought of this episode, because I've been resisting it for so long. But yeah, I can sort of presume that the feeling about this episode will be quite polarizing. I imagine some people will absolutely love this episode and some people will absolutely detest this episode. What did I think? Well, my thoughts are generally quite positive. I don't know how I feel about the episode as a story, but that's more so because it's very similar to episode 1, in which it doesn't really feel like a story in its own right. It probably feels like more of a story than episode 1, but ultimately you could look at it and say it's sort of a lot of setup. Can you really judge this as a story in its own right? It's less of a story in its own right than perhaps last week's episode, which, while it had the fluxiness going on behind the scenes, it was very much a solid Sontaran story. And I think that's why I enjoyed that episode a little bit less than other people. I still enjoyed that episode. I think the sort of title and general mood of that review may lead some people to think that perhaps I didn't enjoy it all that much. I did enjoy it. I just felt as if the sort of resolution to the episode was particularly rushed, and it almost felt a bit pointless in retrospect. But this episode felt more so set up, and it's sort of a very weird episode to judge because you're sort of learning new things. You also feel as if ultimately this episode wasn't all that necessary, although you do learn some new stuff. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about this episode, and if you've watched my other Flux reviews and my preview that I did for Doctor Who FLUX, and just any of my videos on the Chibnall era in general, I suppose, then you'll know that I was a big fan of this episode because it was experimental. It was something different, something new. The episode wasn't so much linear. It was sort of all over the place, and yeah, sort of jumped around a bit with different events in different time zones, and it wasn't quite clear what was going on, some timey stuff, and it was just very odd. It was very weird, and it was very experimental in its format, but I particularly enjoyed that because one of the things I've been saying about Chibnall and his 2 series for a while is that it felt stale, it felt samey, it felt very routine Doctor Who. To quote the man himself, what he said about Trial of a Time Lord, very routine running down corridors and scaring monsters, to quote Chris Chibnall from what he said to Pip and Jane Baker about Trial of a Time Lord back in the 80s. It very much was feeling a bit stale, and I was crying out for some experimentation. One thing I really loved about Stephen Moffat, regardless of his faults, is he always knew that he was going to do something a bit experimental, something a bit high concept, that perhaps not everyone loved, but there was always that intention there to do something a bit more interesting than your stereotypical Doctor Who. And that's something I'd been crying out for to see more of from Chibnall's Who, because we've barely seen any of that. It Takes You Away is really all that I could really point to say this is experimental, that and Can You Hear Me, and I didn't really like those 2 episodes, so I was really crying out for not just something that was experimental and a bit weird, but something that was actually good as a result of that. And I feel as if this episode was. I love stories that play with time and just get very weird. I think as I've gotten older, I've really come to appreciate TV shows and films and just media in general that get a bit weird, that sort of deconstruct the format and just go, yeah, to hell with your linear storytelling. And this episode does that. I think that this episode could be seen as a bit pointless, because when you sort of look at this episode, all it really is the Doctor saving the day and resolving the cliffhanger from the previous episode for 54 minutes. And I think you could probably say, was this all this necessary? You know, was this a necessary episode? Was it a bit pointless? But ultimately, I do think it was rather not necessary, because I think they're stretching it a bit, so you could have quite easily trimmed out this episode, or shortened down what we find out about this episode, because we do learn pivotal things in this episode. But the episode as a whole could be trimmed down. But I just think to set a marker onto this series, say, yeah, we're going to do some really experimental and interesting stuff, we're going to throw loads of concepts at all, some very high concept ideas that not everyone's going to like, but you know, this is a time and space travel show, so let's just go and do some weird stuff. You know, I appreciate that. I think it really sets the tone for the last remaining episodes. I'm not necessarily saying that Chibnall's going to do another episode like this, but ultimately I think for what it is, it was particularly interesting, and yeah, I just love the experimental nature of it. I could already tell, as I said, that some people weren't going to like this episode just because of how bizarre it is in its storytelling, but ultimately I appreciate that an attempt was made, and overall I'd say it was fairly successful. Now, this episode is very odd in its format, but ultimately the main crux of the story is it almost feels as if, you know, you get those American TV shows. The main example that comes to my head is Prison Break, in which you'll get a episode that's just dedicated to flashbacks. I think Torchwood did an episode like that, didn't it? Yes, it did. Fragments. You know, those sorts of episodes. This almost reminded me a bit of that, albeit with a Doctor Who twist, in which we're learning certain pivotal bits about the characters and their backstories we have no knowledge of, but ultimately it's very pivotal to the story. But my issue, and I think it's really one of my few issues with this story, is that I almost don't think it did enough with that premise. I think what it does for Vinda and what it does for the Doctor is great. Particularly the stuff with the Doctor, I think that was particularly interesting. We obviously got to see more stuff with the Division, what they're about, more stuff with the Roof Doctor, albeit that was brief. But we see what her deal was, the Division, what they were doing to do with Swarm and that stuff. We sort of assumed that was the case, and we get confirmation of it here. And one thing I like about this is it makes the Division and the Timeless Child almost seem worthwhile. Almost. I still am not quite saying it was worthwhile, but it almost makes the Timeless Child idea in retrospect better, because I can see where they're going with this story. I can see the interesting story potential that is coming out of this, which is something I didn't really see in Series 12. I think that the idea of the Timeless Child as it was sold to us in Series 12 was horrendous. I think the actual episode, and not only how it delivered these ideas and how it was structured as a story in general, how it derailed the Cyberman plot, how it was essentially just a PowerPoint presentation, that whole episode was terrible still, but this almost makes it seem a bit worth it, because there's interesting story potential with the Timeless Child and that idea that we're seeing here. The whole idea of not only this, the Doctor almost being a bit of a different character and being more militaristic, this aspect of the past that the Doctor didn't know about, and almost consequences of her past that we weren't quite sure of. You know, we never knew this. The Doctor's not even sure about herself, but now she's got to retrace her steps, retrace her past that she's not even familiar with, because it's key to the flux, and the consequences of her actions, you know, is taking place in the present. I think that's quite interesting. That's the thing that I criticise, and many of us criticise the Timeless Children for, was that this doesn't really change anything, and there didn't really seem to be any consequences from that, and that might have been a bit naive from us, because ultimately we hadn't seen any future stories with that idea. I think that I think the problem was is that it was revealed at the end of the series and we had to wait so long that we've essentially had to wait over a year to actually find out where this is actually going. So I understand why myself and others sort of had that notion towards the Timeless Child, but I think we should have had more faith in Chibnall. I mean, I know he hasn't really done much to deserve that faith really, but ultimately we should have had more faith in Chibnall that perhaps this was going somewhere and in more interesting ideas, which is what we get here. I love the idea of just like the mystery. I think the mystery is what I love about this, because that's what we've been lacking. So much is a mystery, a well-constructed mystery, might I add, because we've had mysteries before in Doctor Who recently, but not since the Matt Smith era. I don't think have we had such a well-structured mystery that is actually intriguing. From here, I like that they not only brought back Joe Martin, but they also brought back the actor who played Swarm briefly in episode 1 before he regenerates in inverted commas into the new Swarm. Sam Sproul, is that the actor's name who plays the new Swarm? Either way, he's not in this episode much, but he is brilliant, his performance. But we see more of the other Swarm, and that was interesting. It's a different take on this villain. I think Sam Sproul is certainly more camp, whereas this one was perhaps more gravelly and perhaps more understated, but I like that as different portrayals. I think it's really hinting at this regeneration aspect, which I know a lot of other people sort of speculated on, but that was all good. I like Jodie Whittaker being given different stuff to do. I like her almost having to play a different version of her own Doctor, which you guys know I like that. I like it when they're giving Jodie Whittaker more flexing her acting chops, giving her more serious stuff to do. You guys know that I think that ultimately she's a lot better when doing that than her more comedic stuff, which I find a little grating. So I'm glad that she got to flex her acting chops, play a different side to her Doctor, which all Doctors I think is great at doing. We see Tennant do it a little bit with the Meta Crisis, we see Matt Smith do it with Mr. Clever and Nightmare and Silver, so it's nice to see Jodie given that opportunity here, and I thought all of that stuff, the mystery, the world building, the intrigue is great. I like the idea that it's got something to do with the Doctor and her actions. Who's that older woman that we see briefly who sort of started the Flux? I'm gonna call it, I think she's a Time Lord. I think this is something to do with the Time Lords. I'm gonna say, sort of saying that Swarm was a necessary evil that they unleashed to almost progress the Flux. If the Flux wasn't enough, they clearly want to destroy the universe, something about the universe's time being over. I'm calling it now, that's a Time Lord, but I really find it interesting that this is sort of man-made, conjured. It wasn't just like a natural event, which I sort of presumed it was man-made. But what I find interesting is that we know it's not Swarm and Azure's doing. We know that it was someone else's, and they're also the ones who released Swarm. So I like this idea that there's almost a Grand Master behind this, pulling the strings. And yeah, this episode, yes, answers some questions. It also opens up a lot of questions as well, but I like the intrigue. I like this sort of setting up more stuff as well, and all these different questions about the Flux. I like that we see a bit more of an empty universe now that the Flux has taken shape, actually. The first a little bit reminded me a bit of Interstellar. The only reason I say that is because I watched Interstellar for the first time not that long ago. Great film, by the way. Really enjoyed it, actually. But that's besides the point. In the new character, the female character that we get, which I don't actually know the name of, you guys know the one who's in love with Vinda, how she was just sort of narrating what happened in the days since the Flux and what happened to the planets. It did remind me of the first bit of Interstellar where they're sort of talking about, the dust and just sort of reflecting on those sort of events. It did give me that sort of vibe, which I'm happy with. I love that we're seeing different perspective of this universal catastrophe. I like that we seemingly are going to get consequences for this, and it's actually had some effect. It wasn't that clear what the Flux had actually done, and now we see that it is sort of destroying some of the universe. Overall, that woman's scenes felt a bit disconnected, but you can see where it's going. I like that it gave us a different perspective on the worlds after the Flux and the aftermath of the Flux. And yeah, she's connected to Vinda, and presumably she's going to come back in a future episode. One thing I will say though is I understand the cameos of certain villains, But I think the Cybermen especially were just disposed of a little bit easily. Now, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding the Sontarans in the previous episode and their Farah game and plot armour. Now, personally, I thought that discussion was very silly. People just blowing stuff completely out of proportion. At the end of the day, main characters are going to have plot armour, and it was only one scene. It's not going to ruin the episode for you. And this certainly didn't ruin the episode for me. This is very much the afterthought of an afterthought. But I did think that the Cybermen were disposed of very easily by one person. It felt quite unrealistic, and ultimately it made the Cybermen just look very weak. I think as opposed to last week's episode where it was just one scene compared to a whole episode that really establishes the Sontarans as a threat. In this, the Cybermen just came across as sort of useless, and I think this sort of repeats an unfortunate pattern going back to ultimately the Moffat era of the Cybermen just being sort of useless, which is a shame. And they was just sort of thrown in there, I imagine, because they're a recognisable foe. They've got the costumes, they had them out not long ago. So I get that. I did like the fact that there was an emphasis on conversion and upgrading when they're talking about their plans. You guys know in the Timeless Children and Ascension of the Cybermen, one thing I hated was the roboticizedness of these Cybermen, and their plan to make all forms robotic was just horrendous and completely misses the point of the Cybermen. So I'm glad that we've gone back to the original aim of the Cybermen, to upgrade, to convert. But yeah, also the Daleks, they look terrible. I sort of understand why. I imagine it's a COVID thing, that they didn't have the physical props there, and it looked like they were all done in CGI, but they really looked quite bad. They looked noticeably bad. And I know Doctor Who's not going to have the best CGI, but ultimately, because of that, don't render all of the Daleks in CGI, because it didn't look good. I don't know whether it's a COVID thing, or maybe they weren't originally in that scene and they sort of added them in post. That one surprised me, because the only dialogue that references the Daleks is a voiceover, which could have been done in post, not when they actually filmed it. So ultimately, it could be likely that they added in the Daleks. Maybe something else was supposed to be there, I don't know. But yeah, they looked a bit crap. But overall, the Cybermen and the Daleks were just cameos. I didn't realise the Daleks were going to be in here, actually, so that was a nice surprise, even if they're only here for about 5 seconds. In terms of the other flashbacks then, I said how much I enjoyed the Doctor's flashback, and I love the sort of uncertainty about the Doctor, the sort of trippiness of the events sort of going in on each other, the Doctor looking round and, certain people not being who they should, like flickering in and out of events. I thought that was all trippy and just great. You guys know I love a trippy time story. I thought Vinder's was quite interesting as well, necessary I think for him, because we really knew nothing about Vinder, so I think it was necessary to explore his past, how he was disgraced, what sort of character he is, also his relationships as well, which get hinted at with the woman who I've forgotten the name of. That was all interesting as well. I thought that was rather necessary to set him up as an actual character, because he very much wasn't a character before. He is now, and I think Jacob Anderson is very likeable as Vinder. I wasn't such a big fan of the Dan and Yaz flashbacks. I think on the surface they were very cool. They were very threatening, very sort of trippy and just quite weird. I like the whole stuff with Dan when he's walking and then suddenly finds himself in a different location at a different time in the day, and then it pans and you see Passenger there. That was all very cool. It reminded me a bit of Forest of the Dead when Donna's having a conversation and then ultimately cuts and she's somewhere else mid-conversation, because that's how time worked in the Cal database. It reminded me of that. No connection to it, but it did remind me of that. It had some similarities. That was all great. I think, yeah, how it was shown, and I thought there was some interesting visual ideas there. But ultimately, in terms of substance, it really tells us nothing more about Dan. It's more there just to be a bit trippy and weird. It sort of reintroduces Di into the frame after she wasn't seen or heard about in the last episode. But ultimately, I think it could have been a really good use of time to explore Dan more as a character, because we know a little bit about him, but we still don't know all too much. But albeit, I think it was more to show Lavinder's was the past one, Yaz was the future, the Doctor was the past, and this was just to show the trippy nature of the time storm, I suppose. So it makes sense in that respect, but I was just saying that perhaps we could have learnt a bit more about Dan. We used to get the weird blue stuff, which I presume that will, come into relevance later on in the series. We also have Yaz's flashback, which was interesting because they said it was the future, which is quite interesting. Is she going to return home? Presumably. But Yaz is being stalked by a Weeping Angel, and I'm very interested to sort of hear about why this is. We see a Weeping Angel has infiltrated the Time Storm. How did they do that? Why have they done this? Why are they stalking Yaz? Who knows? I want to speak about the Weeping Angels, actually, because I don't think they're quite doing the Weeping Angels right, as far as I understand them. I think it's sort of a filming issue, ultimately. Not so much a writing issue, because I can see Chris Chibnall writing the Weeping Angels as Moffat writes them, taking on board their basic philosophy. He even does the image of an angel is itself an angel stuff that was in Time of Angels. I love all that stuff with Amy, and the TV and the remote, and it comes out. You guys know I love all that stuff. So it was interesting to see it return here in the guise of a video game. I thought that was all quite interesting. But my main issue is with not only, I think the overuse of shaky cam when directing the Weeping Angels really sort of ruins that idea that they're stood still. I don't think they're being directed quite right, in terms of it doesn't really feel like, they're there, then you move, then you look back, then they've moved. I don't think that's quite right. We got that in the first episode. But even then, the direction was a bit different to how we usually see it before. Again, a bit more of, handheld rather than a static shot. Personally, I think the static shot just works a lot better in conveying the menace and threat of the Angels. It just makes them seem a bit more scarier. So I'm not the biggest fan of the sort of handheld feel that they're using to direct the Angels. I think it takes away a bit of the fright to them. I can't really explain why. It just sort of is that for me, if you know what I mean. I'm not an expert on directing. I'm not entirely sure why it is this way. It just sort of is this way, if you get what I mean. I'm not quite sure why it is. It just doesn't quite work as well for me. But also, I think Chris Chibnall, the writing department, is fine. In the Weeping Angels, it's quite good. But the way they're being directed, not just the handheld, but for example, when Yaz is looking at the angel, and then she turns and looks at the Doctor, and then she goes to pull out the and throw the games console onto the floor, but the angel doesn't move, even though Yaz has looked away. And for me, like that, it's almost visually, it's not conveying the same rules that are in the writing, because when Yaz turns away, the angel should just move and instantly be closer to her, pulling a menacing face. It wasn't doing that, and I think when you break that, you sort of break the rules of the Angels, personally, and when they're not doing that, it makes the Angels and their threat just not really happen, because no one cares that a stone statue is just there. It needs to be, it moves when you don't look away, and if it's not doing that, then the Angels sort of become pointless. So ultimately, I hope in the next episode that inconsistencies in the visual showing of the Angels compared to the writing don't happen like they did in this episode, because I was watching it as a bit I don't know. I'm a big fan of them using the Angels, and personally, next week's episode, I think it's in the next one, a whole town zapped away by the Angels. This is what I love. I love that idea for storytelling. I even had a similar idea when I was planning out Doctor Who story ideas in my head for my own sort of series. These sorts of ideas with the Angels, I love the fact that I'm really excited for next week's episode, because I've been missing a good Angel story. I've always said that I think there's a lot of untapped potential to do with the Angels that we haven't quite seen before, and I love that this seems to be a new interesting idea with the Angels. So even though they weren't perfectly done in here, even though it was more of a setup thing, there's still more questions with the Angels, and I love what story we seem to be getting next week. Overall, this story is just a bit of a jumbled... It's just a jumble. I wouldn't call it a jumbled mess, because by design it's supposed to be a bit trippy, a bit odd, a bit weird, going in and out. Time has gone wrong, so time isn't working properly, so your linear viewing experience isn't working as it usually would. That's conveying the sense of time just being a bit wrong. So that works in the story. I understand the jumbled story structure. It's very much intentional. And I enjoyed it. I like that we explore more of the characters' backstories. I love how experimental and trippy this episode feels. Sometimes it doesn't quite work. Sometimes it feels like you're jumping a bit too quickly. Some of the different parts perhaps don't all seem necessary or don't feel that substantial. Yaz's stuff did very much seem like a basic setup. as did John Bishop's, not really as substantial as Vinder's and the Doctor's, but I like the different intriguing mysteries set up here. I love the story structure. It very much felt to me like Moffat's Doctor Who. It very much, distinctly, I think even the end, when it cut, you sort of leave Vinder on that planet and then you see the TARDIS in the vortex and you cut to them sort of reflecting on the events in the TARDIS. That reminds me of Series 6. That reminds me of Prime Series 6 Part 1. And I like Series 6 Part 1, so I enjoy that. I'm getting strong Moffat-y vibes from this. Time going wrong, all that sort of non-linear storytelling. It's a very tenuous link, but it did remind me of The Wedding of River Song and something Moffat would write, Amy's Choice, those sort of weird experimental stories that you only really got in Moffat's Doctor Who. And again, Silence in the Library, Forest of the Dead, little similarities there, but again, that's a Moffat pen story in the RTD era. One thing I do want to say is I do find it a bit odd that people seem to be loving this, but didn't like Series 6. Again, I don't actually know what the general consensus of this story is, so I don't know if people love it or if people hate it. I imagine it's going to be a bit more polarising than the last couple of weeks, but I haven't looked on Twitter or anything, so I just simply don't know. But the response has been positive from the last 2 weeks, and people seem to be liking this story structure. And to me, this story structure is very reminiscent of Series 6 Part 1. I say Part 1 because Part 2 isn't very interconnected, but Part 1 is, and it's very much giving me vibes of that. And although perhaps it wasn't as interconnected as this, just because there were more filler episodes in there, but that's just how Doctor Who was then, I very much see Chris Chibnall doing what Moffat was attempting to do. And Moffat was sort of shunned and was very much criticised for it, which is why Series 7 is standalone. He never really attempted that extent of interconnected storytelling again. I don't know whether it was just people were sort of fine with the previous format of Doctor Who, so they didn't really want to shake up, and the format hadn't really got stale, as it has now, so people were more willing for a change. I don't know whether just in 2011... the landscape of television was different. People are very much more used to interconnected storylines than, they were back then. So I don't know whether now it feels more like a welcome addition, whereas back then it was perhaps more before its time. I don't know. You guys know I like Moffat and his interconnected story rubbish, so you guys know I love that, so you guys knew that I would enjoy this, especially where it's to do with time. But I just find it interesting that people didn't like that and like this. Is that perhaps hypocritical on Doctor Who fans' parts? Or is it more of a case of the general changing landscape of TV and people are more open to this now just due to the circumstances? I don't know, but it did certainly remind me of something Moffat would do. And I like Moffat's experimentalness, so that's only, credit being given to Chibnall there. I'm a big fan that he actually went and did an experimental story. I love that stuff. So yes, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a like, drop a sub, and hit that notification bell to stay notified for all my latest videos. What did you think of Once Upon Time? Did you enjoy it? Did you not? Whatever you think, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. Overall, I enjoyed this episode. It's hard to really judge it as an episode because it's very much a lot of setup, and the episode could feel perhaps not so substantial. But I like what it sets up, I like what it explores, and overall I just like the experimental storytelling done in this. I'm glad that Chris Chibnall is sort of pushing the boat out and trying lots of different things in this series, and it's feeling very fresh, new, and just very interesting as a result compared to his other two series, which I felt were quite stale and formulaic and very much needed a reinvigorment and a change and something more experimental. That seems to be what we're getting, and I'm very happy with it. Again, I don't know what the consensus is. Is it, negative? Is it positive like I am? I don't know, but all I can say is that I enjoyed this episode, and whatever you think, because I think it's probably a polarising one, drop your thoughts in the comment section. I'd be really interested to read your thoughts. But yes, thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.